Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Applied Research Panel. I am here today joined by Mandela Patrick, who's a CEO at Optimatik, which does the future of AI entertainment. Maria Suciu, who is a senior manager in statistical genetics at the Regeneron Genetics Center. She works, well, she'll tell you a little bit about it soon, but she does sort of statistical analysis of genetic data and drug discovery. We have Kumeren Govender, who is the Chief Scientific Officer at the Global Pathogen Analysis Service, whose title is fairly self-explanatory. And we have Ethan Perets, who is a Schmidt Science Fellow at the UT Southwestern Medical Center, who does work involving lasers and brains, but not at the same time.
We apply lasers, yes.
So yeah, I would like this panel to be fairly interactive. So I'm going to start off with a few questions, and then sort of at around the half-hour point, I'm going to try to open it up to audience questions. So just keep that in mind and start thinking of stuff now so we don't have awkward silence. And with that, we can start. So the first question is just to get us warmed up. So what are you currently working on, and what brings you to this panel? And we can start with Mandela, because he is sitting closest to me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mandela. I'm the CEO of this company called Optimatik. And sort of like my background is like I studied PhD here with Clare as well as Kumeren. We all came on here on the Rhodes Scholarship, and a lot of like my PhD was focused on multimodal AI. So essentially how to train these AI systems not only understand what's happening in the visual world, but also in the oral world. And what was really unique about like my PhD experience here is I got to see how my research was actually also being applied. So I had a partnership with Facebook AI in London, and a lot of like my research was being applied for recommendation systems at Instagram. And so I saw how, for example, research could be really applied at scale. And then at my company, Optimatik, we're sort of taking the best of open source image generative models and applying it to allow people to express themselves in whole new and fun and interesting ways.
It's going to be quite a change of pace. So I'm Maria. Hi, everyone. I'm not actually from the Rhodes family. I'm from the Wellcome Trust family. So I did my PhD here a long time ago in genomic medicine and statistics. What that meant is that I used to be lab-based. So if you were there for the morning, I'm a career switcher. So I moved from lab to computational analysis and statistical analysis. And I've moved away recently from academia into an industry setting. So we use large-scale population studies. You may have heard of UK Biobank or other such studies. And we do sort of statistical analysis of this genetic data to inform drug discovery. It's sort of a generic term, but my personal interest is in applying this research to try to look at diseases that have no treatment, so unmet need. For example, I've started an area in women's health, and I'm really sort of focused on that and trying, in terms of sustainable in a better future, trying to bring some of this technology to these areas that people tend to maybe forget about.
Great. Hi, everyone. So my name's Kumeren. It's always great to be back at Rhodes House, and so there's just so many memories, over the years. And yeah, it's wonderful to see, the new build as well. So currently I am the Chief Science Officer at a company called the Global Pathogen Analysis Service. And as Claire said, it's fairly self-explanatory. That's exactly what we do. Now, this particular organization was the brainchild of Sir John Bell, together with David Agus, who leads the Ellison Institute, as well as Larry Ellison. And this really was born during the COVID pandemic. And the idea was that during the COVID pandemic, a lot of countries, could not really deal with new variants. They could not pick up new variants and monitor that and respond effectively. And so what we did is develop a cloud-based online secure tool where you could upload your genomic sequencing data. And sort of we partnered with multiple companies and other research institutes in the world, but also public health organizations. So worked with the Australian government, with the Canadian government, with UK HSA, which was known as Public Health England a while back, and then also with Brazil, South Africa. So a whole lot of countries. And during the height of the pandemic, we had about 200,000 COVID samples actually uploaded to the platform. and countries were using it to actually monitor vaccine response, because you could look at were the new variants coming up, you could look at it by geography. So that's what we do at GPAS, and we work in close collaboration as well with a few other institutes, so with the Ellison Institute, but also the Tony Blair Institute as well. So yeah, excited to talk about that. Just a bit of background about myself as well. So I did my DPhil here from 2018 as a Rhodes Scholar, and then I co-founded a company as well named Mabel in personalized medicine, and sold that in April. And yeah, that's why I'm here on the panel today.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Ethan. I am a postdoctoral researcher at UT Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas, Texas. So I flew in yesterday and very happy to be here. I am here today because I'm a Schmidt Science Fellow. So this is one of the partner organizations of the Rhodes Trust. And in my role as a postdoctoral researcher at UT Southwestern, I am actually working on understanding how the immune response is activated in the brain, in the context of the brain. And so sometimes we do shoot lasers at brains to address that question. And I'm working on this in the context of hopefully applying what we can understand molecular mechanisms of how the brain works, how inflammation works in the brain, to understand and treat the causes of neurodegenerative diseases. That being said, the impetus of the Schmidt Science Fellowship is really a unique one. My training was, my PhD was actually in physical chemistry. And so the whole impetus of the Schmidt Science Fellowship is to switch disciplines between your PhD and your postdoctoral research. And so I'm looking at ways that I can apply knowledge that I gained from my PhD in physical chemistry to this new area of neurobiology and the immune responses in the brain. And a little bit of background on me. So I'm happy to be back in the UK. I did my master's actually in London in the humanities. So I actually did a master's degree at the Courtauld Institute of Art, studying Buddhist art history. And so that led me to all sorts of interesting places, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that I had to do in those instances was really apply my knowledge as a scientist. So I was working in conservation science in those contexts to try and understand artworks and the materials of artworks, and ended up going and doing this master's because I needed to interact with multiple stakeholders at those institutions, and I wanted to know their language. And I think that's one of the questions that we'll hopefully dive into, is how to deal with different stakeholders.
Yeah, that actually segues very nicely into the first question that I wanted to ask, which is sort of, what does purpose-driven or applied research look like in your particular field? And what sort of institutional or systemic factors can sort of accelerate it or slow it down in your experience? So maybe we'll rotate one, so we can start with Maria.
Great, thank you. So I think, there's a few things to touch on that. So I'll maybe start with the negatives and then we end on a positive note. And, David Hansen mentioned this earlier this morning that, sometimes there's a lot of distractions, and I feel like that's maybe in a group that does a lot of research like ours, we get distracted by a lot of cool stuff coming up. So that's sometimes what hinders it. Like, we're trying to figure out what to focus on in an area where, you can focus on many things and keep very busy, but what will be most impactful? So I think that's one of the challenges. One of the other challenges is in genetic data, and maybe we go back to this, is diversity and representation. So, we make a lot of inferences looking at this data that's still predominantly white European, and then we try to design drugs that will apply to everyone. So one of the challenges is increasing this diversity. So we've been very purposeful in building collaborations and infrastructure in areas that are underrepresented. On a positive note, what I think has been really changing for me, coming from academia, I thought industry will be very closed. I really think that where I'm at now, Regeneron Genetics Center is very intentional about being open source, increasing access for people, because sometimes academia is a bit skeptical if you publish from industry, so we really kept ourselves at a high standard, so that has helped. And then resource. It has helped me. I'm on the research side of a pharma company that has a big budget and believes in genetics. So I tend to find, if we propose projects, once you pass the grilling, you always have to support your claims. There is resource to go out and tackle it. So I think from that point, I'm spoiled. But.
Yeah, so I guess talking with GPAS, we sort of work really closely with the university, and we sort of leveraged 15 years of the research, particularly the pathogen research that the University of Oxford has used. Now, the way our organization works is that we sort of commission Oxford to work on specific projects. And so it's a very interesting licensing model because we ourselves don't do the R&D, but the R&D is almost outsourced to Oxford. And my dream is to actually sort of fund more postdoctoral students and PhD students via the company. And so really creating this close industry sort of university collaboration. And I guess there's benefits and there's a lot of problems that come with it. And I think to touch on some of the problems, and that's I think something we're all aware of, sort of being part of the university ecosystem, particularly when we explore innovation, is about IP and these conversations about how the university owns IP. Can you spin off it? Can you monetize it and commercialize it? And I think we've done a relatively good job with actually working with OUI, which I do agree has been quite difficult to work with in sort of in history. But I think we've got a really good licensing agreement where we can actually particularly sort of request and fund research that has a particular purpose. And for us, it's really about global public health. And so now we're focusing on tools for tuberculosis and also for pandemic preparedness and biosecurity. So I think the bureaucracy of working with the university and the NHS is there. But I think sort of navigating that is also a strength because very few companies actually can do that and have done that. Yeah, and I guess some of the benefits as well, sort of working with the university is, I think, like many Ivy League schools, working with the University of Oxford is already a brand by itself. And I think we all know sort of leveraging that for global good is definitely something that we've seen a lot of response to, and I think that's been really welcomed.
We're doing the roundabout.
Sure. So, going off two of those points actually, so on diversity of data, and so how we apply research and technology is taking a lot of the open source models, so particularly we build upon Stability AI, which is like a UK-based company, their image text stable diffusion model, but they're training a lot of honestly unbiased, very biased data sets. And what we're trying to do with our company is how do we allow people to express themselves in content in whole new and expressive ways that represent who they are. And people are very particular about how they look, and self-expression is something that's very personal. And if you sort of take these models out of the box and apply it to this use case, it's not that satisfactory. And so we spend a lot of time on how do you tune these models, fine-tune these models, prompt these models to sort of like minimize as many biases as possible so that people can actually have fun and play with these systems in sort of like new and interesting ways. And then on sort of like the IP side, all of these open source models come with different licenses. And depending on the license, it actually determines if you can use it for commercial use or not. And that I think we've seen a wide variety of different companies use different licenses, but we've been restricting ourselves to licenses that is commercially applicable. And I'm hoping that simplifies where most there's just so much nuance with these licenses now. I just wish that hopefully in the future to make applying research easier, that we standardize the licenses, where it's like commercial, not commercial, and isn't all of these different letters and all that fun stuff. So both on the IP side, that's been an interesting challenge on applying research, and then sort of bias in data sets.
Yeah, so at UT Southwestern, it is what you might expect of a academic institution. So, the mission of UT Southwestern is actually threefold. It's to educate and discover, which are all go hand in hand with its identity as a university. It's also very interesting because its third element of its mission is healing, which I'm not sure is something that one is always exposed to in a university system. And the reason for healing is because UT Southwestern is embedded within a world-class hospital, right? So that presents a lot of very exciting opportunities for applying research. Probably the most immediate being that if you are interested in working on a specific topic relevant to disease, that you are actually have access to samples. And so getting those sorts of input into the research process and working with clinicians is all happening on that campus and in a very at a very, very large scale. I think another aspect of really encouraging applied research is interdisciplinarity. So while everyone at UT Southwestern is actually on this mission of solving diseases, this is being really addressed from all different sorts of angles, from virology, from immunology, evolutionary biology, all different sorts of angles to address a set of problems, which is how to solve diseases. And I think,
You mind, sorry to interrupt, I just wanted to build on that, because
Sure.
it was a thought also from Mandela, because I thought, I was in an academic environment, and most of you have been in that, and I think it's very interesting to think, so I was very happy to find a company where I'm at, where they're being very creative about academia and industry, and exactly what you were saying about hospital records, and I'm sure GPAS experienced this, where, for example, we realized, so we're looking at trying to identify rare changes in our DNA that protect us from certain diseases. And when I say rare, one of our recent published findings is 1 in 600,000, 1 in 500,000. So it's very rare. And we realized we can't go at it alone. And from the academia side, they can't go at it alone, even though they have the patient data. So we've become very creative in the way we negotiate and collaborate for a common goal, and almost in a way kind of maybe shaking the capitalist system that we were discussing about earlier. We've kind of focused on the common goal, and it's new models of negotiation. So I thought it's something to keep in mind when you go for your next organization. There's a lot of new models of, it's no longer academia-industry divide.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, even on that point, so I was saying, so I spent most of my PhD at Meta, and what was interesting is that Meta has sort of emerged in this AI wave as like this darling company because they're pro open source. As in, outside of their business, like I'm not talking about like the business and the company itself, but particularly within AI, they have emerged as this like darling company because they've been the only company that's been truly open source in their technology. But I think what's been interesting is that I personally don't think it's that much due to any sort of like moral sense. I think it's just fundamentally it's like a very good business decision because what's really powerful about open source is that you have the entire community building with you to actually push the technology forward. And so Facebook gets the capital because there's actually this concept of like the network effects of open source where we're seeing this with Stability Diffusion's model as well, where all of the innovations happening in the image generative space is happening on top of Stability's model instead of, say, OpenAI's model because Stability's model is open source. And so Facebook is seeing something very similar with the Llama model that was open source, where there is this huge network effects of progress happening on their model. And I think it's just very much in their best interest to be pro-open source, and I think that's been pretty fascinating.
we're interesting because I'm in a pharma company where as much as we push to get our code out there, some of it is out there, but still the industry is, so I'm kind of at the opposite pole, and we're like, let's push it out, and then the company's like, yeah, let's check it for 2 years, and we're like, that's not fast enough. So you'll have a lot of this, extremes.
Yeah, maybe this ties nicely into my next question, which is about the sort of role of like open source and open data in science, sort of the potential benefits in terms of reproducibility and in terms of sort of the ability of the public to build on your work, and also the potential dangers, in particular in terms of privacy. I don't know if anyone is particularly interested in this.
Start off with this, and I think no matter what field we're in, I think there's some sort of relation, with open data, open software, and I was at a very sort of high-level genomics panel last week in Westminster. So it was called the Global Genomics Conference, and the CEO of Genomics England was there, and they've got a new initiative to sequence 100,000 babies. And the idea is they actually want to do rare diseases from the time a baby is born, but then use that sequencing data to inform personalized health throughout somebody's life. And this is sort of in a preventative way in terms of risk scoring diseases. So you could actually use genomics and sort of pair that with risk and sort of change the way you would prevent, for instance, heart disease. So you might start statins a bit earlier, for instance, if you have a higher genetic risk. And I think some of the key takeaways, with open data is that we need open data because we're sort of in a society where for the amount of innovation that we want to do with big data and AI, we sort of need these data sets. But how do we get partners to come together to secure this in a collaborative way? But also importantly, how do we ensure that the stakeholders all benefit from it, and largely with open data, particularly, with UK Biobank, and there's a new study called Our Future Health, which you might have been aware of. It's going to be the largest UK medical data set that exists, and the idea is to collect data from 5 million patients, and the idea is this is how we're going to alleviate sort of pressure on the NHS. And the big problem, I think, is how do those individuals who participated in the study benefit from it?
Yeah, I think on that point, with sort of like bio data, that's obviously very difficult to access, and so you need these mechanisms to make it openly accessible, particularly in the more classical generative AI case. So you have these LLMs and you have these image-to-text models. Although they're training data just on the internet, but people, like, none of these companies actually own the data. And so you have this really big problem where how do you sort of compensate or sort of reward people whose data has been used to train these models without their consent, usually without their consent. So that's one aspect. So that's only on the open data side, is particularly in places where data is more accessible via the internet. Like, what are those mechanisms to sort of, to your point, like make sure that people actually benefit? And then,
if I can just build on that, like, with genetic data, you guys may have heard. I mean, there's recently been a scandal, 23andMe, right? Like, genetic data is something that people, at least you see in the media, want. I will just add and put it in your mind that genetic data without other data is not as valuable, but it's this coupling that you were talking about. Like, genetic data with medical data is what people really want. And the UK Biobank is very open. We were an industry collaborator, so people are finding models. But still, what's not very clear is how do you empower the participants? And we really do rely on that. You have all these initiatives. One good thing about the UK is, and people, the US is looking at it admiringly, is like they have managed via the NHS to figure out a model where they give access to anyone in the world, commercial, non-commercial. But it's still very difficult. Like, we try to make sure that, you need to, if you want to increase diversity, you need to go in these communities. Like, the UK is highly educated. People went to UK Biobank. But you want to build relationships and infrastructure in the places that will help you increase the diversity. And there, there's a lot of history and stigma around, empowering the people and making them want to contribute to your research. And I think that's really, like the newborn study, it's really at the forefront of, it should be at the forefront of our conversation. How do you feel about it? Are you like empowered, and do you feel like, yes, I want to opt in for that? Or are you just going with the flow? Like, we're kind of getting to this era.
Actually, on that point, I think one interesting thing I think particularly I saw with COVID and was particularly in certain marginalized communities, there has been a big stigma against like vaccines and all that good stuff. And that has been because some of these innovations have exploited sort of like marginalized communities. And so I think it's also just like a cultural thing at play where there's just a stigma in giving your data to corporations and that has traditionally exploited people.
Just to add to that, I think it's sort of the conversation we had in the morning about really thinking about these things from the inception of the study. And, speaking about, for instance, our future health, this is something they've really thought about, particularly with genomics, where you actually need a diverse data set. And it's quite funny because in their marketing, they say we don't go to Waitrose. We set up shops outside Tesco and Sainsbury's so that everybody can access it, But but I think the point being we need to think about this early on. And I think if we do that within in mind, I think that would lead to better data sets and more representative data sets.
I think one point we hadn't touched on is like open. So there's open data, which is sort of making data more accessible. Open source is making a lot of the code and the model weights accessible. I think what's been interesting there is we've seen a lot of the innovation happen from just regular people getting access to this technology in a way that we have, like, to the point that like big tech can't even keep up. And so when, for example, Llama was originally released earlier this year, same thing with Stability Diffusion, in a month or two time frame, the innovation and pace of innovation we saw was just unparalleled. And these were happening from people all over the world with just like not the same level of resources. I think constraints do breed innovation. And so while OpenAI gets to train these models on probably like what, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of GPUs.
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands of GPUs. Most people don't have access to a GPU or maybe have access to only their like actual consumer hardware. And so you saw a lot of these models actually getting smaller and to the point where it can actually be used on consumer hardware and on people's devices. And so I'm a big fan of just open source pushing the field forward, particularly where innovation has to happen within constraints. Yeah.
Claire, could we actually get, I don't know, Ethan, if you wanted to share. I'm really curious about how you feel about the open source code in academia.
Well, the open source, I can't speak too much to that, but I think Kumeren's initial point that kind of got this all kicked off, which was the importance of open data to innovation. And, I am working currently as a fellow also with a VC fund because I wanted to understand more about, what do VCs do actually. And I've started working on a first project with them, and quickly one of the things that we realized we needed, or that possibly the field needs to push along a therapeutic methodology is access to the data from clinical studies. Because in the area that we're looking at, there's about 10 drugs that have been approved as clinical use, and there's tons of drugs using similar methodologies, but we have no idea why those have failed where these other 10 have succeeded. And a large reason, I believe, that for why there's this inability to understand that question is because we don't have the access to some of the data from all of those clinical studies. And of course there are issues surrounding, how much of that data can be shared to respect patient confidentiality and these sorts of things. But, that could be an area for true collaboration between academics who want to actually understand why a certain methodology, in what situations it can and cannot be successful, with the goals and desires of an industry partner. And so I wonder, Maria, if there's discussion around how to foster that sort of more open environment and sharing results of clinical studies with academic partners.
Hold my beer. No, I'm joking.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's also, I've kind of just got 2 points in my mind. I realized that we're kind of coming to the contour of two ideas, right? We have this crowdsourcing when it comes to coding that you can really use for pushing that boundaries forward. And when it comes to generating biomedical data, we have all these barriers. And I will say, I think we were touching on this last night, that being now in a pharma environment, I'm seeing, people really try to make very tough and hold themselves responsible when making these decisions for the clinical trial. So it is a lot of work that goes into this to make sure things work, because it's a lot of money. When it comes to sharing, I think there's still a little bit of fear of, how we have that IP competition. So in a way, the negotiation I was mentioning earlier, has not, the game theory hasn't reached the multiple pharma companies to say, actually, we're all benefiting from sharing this. There's a push. We're putting more and more forward. For example, we're one of the companies that publish all our findings. It does impact, right? For example, when we have a clinical study that goes maybe less well than we expected, your stock is affected, but we kind of take that responsibility. There's a lot of, so this is one of the reasons, monetization, right? Some pharma companies don't want to put it out there. The other thing is, I think, also human factor. When you're in a company that's been around for 3 decades, and people's jobs hang on a clinical study, sometimes, I know this sounds very qualitative, but I've seen it happen, if things don't go well, people almost want to bury that project and be like, let's move on, next project. So it's this combination of, I think it's a bit of hard work to hold yourself accountable, figure out how you still make money. So it's all these factors, but there is a push.
It's a comment from one of the earlier panels today about having more open discussions about failure, and showing that those discussions are actually important to the financial futures of the companies.
I think another interesting point instead of how do you make collaboration between industry and say academia more possible, one of the biggest innovations we've seen in AI is the concept of pre-training. And so what pre-training is that you train these models on large amounts of data, and then you could then apply these models on much smaller data sets and actually get really good performance. And so it's this sort of what we call few shot or one shot sort of models. And so what's really exciting is that a lot of and this is kind of what OpenAI and all of these companies have done, which is they've spent billions of dollars training these really large models, but then they could sort of allow someone like a business or a researcher to then use that model on a much smaller data set and actually drive impact and learn a model. And so I think that's going to be, the future of these sort of collaborations, is these large models then being applied to these very, very specialized data sets, allowing innovation to happen pretty much in a democratized fashion.
Yeah, I'm going to interject here because we are at the 26 minutes left mark, and I want to make sure we have time for audience questions, and I also have one that I want to end with. So with that, do we have anyone in the audience? Yes?
Hi, I'm Yiming. I'm doing a DPhil at Wellcome Center for Integrative Neuroimaging, and one of the aims for my DPhil study is to train a really large model on the UK biobank neuroimaging dataset. And one of the lessons I've learned during the last couple of weeks is data analysis on large-scale data is really complicated, needs a lot of expertise, especially for engineering, computer science, and maths, which means many of the people in the world from different departments relevant to medical care do not have access or do not understand this kind of stuff, just like what this kind of analysis means. Is it possible or is it necessary to have kind of an interface between the data set and the user to help these people from the clinicians, also physicians and doctors, to have an interface and interact better with the insights we've gained from the data set?
All right, I'm just going to recap that question because I think we're recording this and I want to make sure people can hear. So the question was basically doing large scale data analysis is super hard. And it's not something that necessarily a doctor would have the expertise to do. So how do you design interfaces to allow sort of on the ground users who care a lot about the results of this analysis to actually be able to use it?
I have some thoughts because we work on that, but I'm going to give a chance to people.
Go for it, yeah.
So, we work actually on this data as well, which is the benefit, UK Biobank, open resource, and I think there's maybe two aspects to think in there. You have the research aspect. It's a playground. We don't know yet what we're going to find, but we have some questions about, exploring that data. You do need huge resource, and you do need to build the expertise to kind of interpret it correctly, because big data, big caveats. But then I think there's the other layer of like, how do you return this to the public? And for that, we have been thinking, the problem is still there's some unknowns. Like, what can you extract from it that you can use? For example, there's like, obviously from MRI you can get body mass imaging. Like, for the background, for people who don't know this, basically participants from the UK Biobank were getting to 100,000, but they haven't yet released that, have gone and got full body MRIs. And that's available for people to look at, coupled with all sorts of other data. But then it's, how do you slice it and dice it to use it? And we found that maybe, I don't know, you should look at body fat distribution or things like this and correlate it with other data. But I think until we sort of get clarity on how, one of the research projects gets applied and translated for clear benefit, it's really hard to bring to the clinic, because the doctor is not going to care that you found a really cool thing like that we find, but if they need to, is it going to change what I'm telling the patient? And I think that's where we almost wanted to touch on these different stakeholders. It's important to have conversations and see what do people care about. We're doing all this innovation and processing images, but how are we going to use them to improve healthcare? What can they get out of them? Can they do scanning for like heart disease risk? Can they do scanning for like breast cancer or lung cancer? And all of these, there's groups that handle it, but I think until you nail some of those questions and it is, I think, our responsibility to translate and communicate with the stakeholders. But I don't think it's going to be adopted in the clinic, and I don't think they need to have the expertise. They need to know, is this patient getting a different treatment or not?
And for me, I think what's, for me, one of the most exciting parts about the AI era is when you think about what programming is, it's sort of like essentially operating at some level of abstraction to talk to a computer. And I think what's been really interesting with the LLM era is the abstraction layer has now moved even higher to just English. And so we're seeing a lot of really interesting companies pop up where you can interact with these very large data sets by just asking a query like, hey, what percentage of users or percentage of patients suffer from X disease? And there's been a bunch of interesting companies pop up within the last few months where just pure natural language becomes the interface between interacting with data and massive data sets. And so I think that's only going to increase even more in the future, where these models can take very large unstructured data, synthesize it, and then basically package it for users with just a simple natural language query.
Yeah, Kumeren, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this, given that your company is basically doing this for pathogens.
No, exactly. So I think, if you look at just the model, right, you have a lot of basic research, applied research, and I think every discipline sort of has its niche area and its role, right? And I think there's a role sometimes just for R&D, particularly in basic science, and from the results, there's a whole lot of applications that we didn't know existed, right? And a lot of them, are just accidental. And then there's sort of very focused research where we sort of know what the problem is on the ground. And in the medical context, it often comes from, clinicians who have worked with patients for many, many years and know sort of on the ground, maybe these are the problems that have been encountered. And I think in some sense you want this ongoing feedback loop between sort of the applied research and the problems on the ground. And I think that's really important. And that's something we try to do, at GPAS, because the clinicians who sort of work with us are also researchers, also sort of part of the company. And so the idea is that we really try and focus it at at the level of when we actually think about the research we want to do, we sort of know the impact that it would make. But having said that, and this is regardless of what field you're in, you have the R&D component, and then, whether commercializing it is viable and whether users are able to use it is a whole different discussion altogether. And so often, they go well together. Often you have a great product that just, users cannot use. And, speaking, as a doctor, if there's another form for me to go through, I'm probably not going to do it. So.
Very important to acknowledge, regardless of what field you're in, that understanding the people that you want to use your research, what are their interests, and how are you going to communicate what your research can do for them, to them? That means taking the time to actually learn to develop a common language with the users that you want of your research. Without that, without a common shared language, then it's never going to happen. Yeah.
I just like to bring that back, like echo that and bring it back, to sustainability. I mean, there is a different kind of sustainability that doesn't just relate to climate. It's like the sustainability of this research is, a lot of it is publicly funded. Like, we can simplify it a lot. These people are publicly funding it because there's a promise of improved healthcare. So it is the responsibility of us to make sure that we can communicate that and, and that people still believe in it. I mean, they're the holders of the data. We wouldn't be able to do this. So, yeah, it's the common language is essential.
Discussion that Ethan and I had just before this was about sort of focusing on the actual problem. And the importance of that. Like, the idea shouldn't be, here's a cool genetic test, you should try it. The idea should be, what problem are we trying to solve, and how could we do that? And I think that is where you can see universities, at least in my mind, sort of has some sort of purity, because in some sense, we have a problem, we're trying to solve it, and we're not focused on a particular type of technology, a particular application that might be, advantageous to our business model. And so I think that's quite important.
I'll step up on my little soapbox here for a moment. And, as someone at an academic institution, I'm thinking about my answer to this question in the context of, well, I have a specific problem that I may want to look at, but this question is really related to, even larger questions about how do we get new researchers from all different sorts of disciplines. I'm not just talking STEM, I'm talking about some of the examples we heard this morning about bringing sociologists or anthropologists or humanists into these conversations. How do we get them into these sorts of conversations, get them to work towards all of these groups working towards a common goal of applying, and this is a question that I think we can all think about, but one of the answers, I think, to that has to be, it can't just happen as it's currently happening in the private sphere. I think these sorts of high-risk, long-term outputs, which governments usually don't actually have a lot of ability to fund, hopefully can be, through policy change, actually funding more of these, high-risk, long-term output projects. So,
all right, I'm going to cut off the conversation now so we can get to at least one more audience question. You were very quick, so let's go.
Thank you. So actually, I have two questions. If that's, I don't know. Yeah. So one question is about open sourcing, and another question is about pre-training. Clare also asked some question about open sourcing, and it seems that all of the people are advocates of open sourcing models, but I also.
But yeah, I have been conspicuously silent as a DeepMinder.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, what do you think about the risks of possibly open sourcing models? There are some people, on Twitter or something say, like, if you open source models, that can be quite dangerous for malicious users. You can, some people have successfully back engineered some vectors back to words, so it's quite dangerous if some people are smart enough to retrieve important or secret information from open source models. So what do you think of the possible risks about this? And another thing is about pre-training. I think Mandela mentioned that you envision a future that big companies train open source models and academia use those models to apply them on some downstream talks. Yeah. But I feel like that's a bit frustrating. I'm doing my DPhil in NLP, so I feel like I'm always waiting for tech giants to release their models, and I feel. I believe people can feel me. So and apply them on very trivial tasks. So what can academia do in kind of like the kind of like more foundational tasks?
Yeah, no, as in so to give you a sense of just how crazy I think there's the disparity in access to resources. So during my DPhil, I was in the VGG computer vision group here at Oxford. It's one of the most, if not probably the most famous computer vision group around. I was fortunate to spend most of it at Facebook, and everyone else in my lab had to use lab GPU resources. I was training my models on 400 GPUs, and while my lab mates were training it on like 4.
And you have 4.
Yeah.
4 is good.
Yeah. And yeah, it changed the type of research I had access to do versus definitely my lab mates. And so I worked on the most computationally expensive type of research, which was video and multimodal video, while most of my lab mostly worked on either images or downstream tasks on video models. And so I think it's just the nature of how the field has moved is that the types of questions and research problems you can focus on is just different to what you can focus on in industry because of just like computational resources. But I do think that's actually a good thing. I think we've seen a lot of the best innovation happen from open source and from people who don't have access to hundreds and thousands of GPUs. And I just encourage everyone to sort of like Llama was, so to give you some actual data, I think it was mentioned earlier in one of the talks, is the Llama model got released from Facebook, I think in February or March this year. And then someone from the community was able to compress the model to run on like computer level laptop hardware in under a month. And that would have never come out of Facebook. Because it just don't have that constraint. Even at my company, we do not have tens of millions or hundreds of millions in funding, and we've had to think a lot about how do you build these models for scale when you cannot afford to train these really large models or inference these large models. And we've actually come up with, like, my co-founder was at Snap, and we came up with a much better system for our company than he'd actually built at Snap because of these constraints. And so I think that's actually one of the more exciting parts about doing a PhD right now, is that you could actually push the field in completely different direction than just the classic LLM direction.
Yeah. Okay, I can take a stab because you did call me out. No, it's fine. Yeah, so I mean, I do think, I was listening to an interview with, I forget his name, it was the guy who came up with like gene drives, like CRISPR-based gene drives, who like gave his like undergraduate students at MIT this challenge of like, can you get either it was ChatGPT or GPT-4 to teach you how to like create and disseminate a smallpox virus. And it gave like quite detailed instructions, which is not ideal. I don't think we want everyone in the world to have access to the knowledge on like, here's which lab you should send your smallpox virus to because they don't do genetic screening. That doesn't seem great. So I do think that there is some concern when you have a model that is like pushing the frontiers of like what machine learning models are capable of, and you don't actually know for sure whether it's capable of doing something that could be really, really bad. Some caution is probably warranted. I mean, that was part of why OpenAI originally proposed sort of doing a slow rollout of GPT-2, which they got a lot of flack for at the time because GPT-2 was like really lame compared to GPT-4. Now, if they did that with GPT-4, everyone would be like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, this thing's crazy good. But
I want to push back a little bit. It's a very cynical view, but I do think a lot of these companies' decisions are fundamentally profit-driven, and and I just think that like it's in OpenAI's best interest and not open source, because their moat is in these models. While for Facebook, for example, their moat is not in training the best LLM. Their moat is honestly manipulating people to get
I mean, sure, the balance sheet has to work out at the end of the year, but I think there is an element that we're not talking about here, which is we love the R&D prototype in the university environment. You love to get the answer, right? But then to make that answer workable in a worldwide, in the world, and make it production, if you want, like make it reliable, there's this element of like productionizing a prototype, which none of us like. It's like boring. It's testing, it's failing. And then, so that's what happens with drugs, with code. That's where I think companies allocate resources. And it's expensive, right? Like those people have to be paid. So I think in a way, we can say, oh, it's profit driven, but we can also think, you know, we take a lot of findings from university, and first of all, sometimes, and I was an academic here, we struggle to reproduce them, or they stop at a point, they're like, we found this, and we're like, okay, so how do we apply it to make the drug? Oh, that's, further research is required. And it's like, and someone has to pay for that. So I'm just saying that I don't think it's quite that black and white, but it's worth remembering, as you say, that sometimes it will feed into their incentive model, but it's also, you know, if you get to play with something for free that was developed through the sweat and tears of someone else, they probably had to be paid. So a more pragmatic, I guess, like, take on it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think what you're hinting at is, these models cost a lot of money. It's like millions, like definitely millions.
Those GPUs, huh?
Yeah, tens of millions of dollars. And so this is why I think questions of like, what are like the best incentive structures that actually benefit real people, I think is super important. And that's why I think you are seeing this bifurcation between, say, Facebook and OpenAI, where it's like because Facebook makes a lot of money in a completely different way, they can actually push the field forward and be open with their research in a way that I don't think OpenAI or DeepMind would ever would.
Yeah, I mean, Google did do Transformers, which they open sourced, which was nice of them. But yeah, no, I think, there's, in the future, as these models get better, I think it might become more of a question of like, okay, do we necessarily want to open source like a raw pre-trained model that we don't really know what it can do or how it could be used? That's like a question for the ethicists at these companies to maybe discuss more. Yeah, that's my main take. And then in terms of like the fact, like how hard it is to be an academic right now, trying to work on large-scale machine learning, I mean, maybe scaling laws will save us. There's like some cases where you can do experiments on like smaller models and like show a scaling law, at least at the smaller scales, which can be of interest to other people and give hints that maybe you'll, so for people who aren't deep in the weeds of machine learning research, basically there are these observations that like the behavior of smaller models extrapolates to the behavior of like really big models in these predictable ways in some cases. So you can sometimes study smaller models and predict what change you made in the smaller model, what effect that'll have in the larger models. But again, that doesn't always hold. There's a lot of emergent phenomena that come up in the bigger models that you would just never see in the smaller ones. So it depends on what you're trying to study, but I think there are potentially still some interesting questions you can ask in smaller models that have the potential to generalize. But yeah, I have 6 minutes and 50 seconds left, and I was hoping to end on a somewhat optimistic, positive note. So I'm gonna give my final question/prompt, which is sort of, if your like current research endeavors are successful, what impact do you think that'll have on the world in the next 10 to 50 years?
Oh, wow.
So I'm interested in understanding molecular mechanisms. I think, you know, one of my, I think, scientific heroes was Vannevar Bush. I'm not sure if anybody's ever heard of him, but he was actually responsible for the National Science Foundation, creation of National Science Foundation in the United States, which, you know, was the model for government funding of science from that time. And I think he describes, obviously, science as this endless frontier, right? That it's never ending, right? So it keeps going, and we're always asking new questions. So, you know, of course, I'm not sure that understanding molecular mechanisms of are going to, you know, solve everything. They're going to keep opening up new questions, but I would like to hopefully see efforts made towards obviously curing of neurodegenerative diseases. I hope that my contribution of actually understanding molecular mechanisms could contribute to new treatments. You know, one thing that I'm really excited about, I don't work on it, but I am excited about in the area of neuroscience is how are we going to be able to keep the brain alive outside of the body for significant periods of time. And I think that's going to be incredibly useful for solving these problems and for actually understanding the molecular mechanisms that were interested in the human brain, not just, what the usual model is, which is great now, which is the animal brain, but actually, the system that we actually care about. And so I think obvious fundamental research is going to have to happen needs to be funded and happen in that area in order to make that sort of transformative impact.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I guess in the 10 years, so I guess with the work I'm involved in right now, there's almost 3 levels that I view this, and particularly the technology that I'm working with. And I think, at an individual level in healthcare, I think the idea, for what I want to do at GPAS is to usher us into the next level of care. And that really means providing new genomic technology for infectious diseases. And we know on an individual level, this has a lot of benefits in terms of faster time to results, for instance, and so you can start antibiotics earlier, and also sort of integrating this genomics with electronic health records. And so the idea is, can you use models to come up with enhanced risk prediction and the way we treat? So I think on an individual level, that's what I really want to see. And we've got some really interesting pilots with the NHS as well and Oracle. So I think that's part of it. Coming from a business background as well, a really important part that we at GPAS focus on is pandemic preparedness and biosecurity. Two very important reasons why we focus on this. One is because the risk for a new pandemic is very real. So there was a report from the Duke Global Health Institute that actually showed that the annual risk of a new pandemic is at 2%, which means overall the course of our lives, there's about a 38% chance that we will see a new pandemic similar to COVID. And so I think we've largely seen, large actors, government sort of see the post-COVID era where we don't need to invest in this technology anymore. And, having the business background, I think I'm trying to really figure out how can we incentivize this technology to actually be adopted by the NHS and by, healthcare systems in the US. And the type of technology I focus on is called metagenomics. And so the idea is, can you use metagenomic sequencing? And then, yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to cut you off because we have 2 minutes to get through 2 more panelists.
Okay.
I'm going to try to make people remember something else in my fall. I'm going to be short and sweet. 10 years, I'm really preoccupied by reducing the data gap in women's health. So if all works well, I'll be having, dreamlike, a drug for endometriosis, which means treating about 50 million women, in the Western world. So that would be pretty neat.
Cool. So a 10 years cure endometriosis.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice.
Ambitious goals.
So we have brain in a jar, no more pandemics.
Oh, wow.
Cure endometriosis. No pressure, Mandela.
I'm completely different. I think to Hans, some more point Hansen brought up earlier, I'm really excited about how do we use this technology to make people more creative, express themselves in whole new different ways. Because at the end of the day, I think for me, I care about the human impact of technology. I think social media hasn't done a great job in actually bringing us together. And I'm hopeful that with the platform we're building, we can use AI to bring people closer together and communicate better. That wasn't possible before.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. We have 46 seconds left. Does anyone have anything they want to leave the...
You
Oh, what am I going to do? Oh, yeah. Well, we're going to solve intelligence and use that to make the world a better place.
Cheers.